right, we're going to look at the respiratory system diagram, and I'm going to save you the time of doing it on your own. We're just going to do this together, okay? And that's going to be my intro to the respiratory system as well. So let's look up here, okay, and number 3. I'm going to start with number 3 because it's on the top part of the body. And what we're looking at here are sinuses, okay? And so the purpose of a sinus is that it produces mucus, and mucus serves the purpose of preventing pathogens, pollen, dusts, different things that the lungs would be very sensitive to from getting into the respiratory system. Okay, so the sinus is definitely a part of the respiratory system because they serve the useful function of making mucus. And so you can see their proximity here to the nasal cavity, and they would be inserting the mucus would be going down there, down those cavities into this area. Okay, so this here is called the nasal cavity. And we'll write that down. So number 4 is the nasal cavity. Whoops, cavity. Okay. And this here is your nose. Okay, so you can call this nose, nostrils, whatever. It's all the same to me. Okay, so I'm going to call it the nose. So if we look at air, I'm going to trace the path of air in yellow. Okay, so air will be going through your nose and your nasal cavities down the back of your throat. Now, the fancy term for back of the throat is the pharynx, okay? So when we did the digestive system, when we went over that, I told you that the pharynx is the common passageway of food and air, and now you can see why, okay? So if you're thinking, what's a pharynx? It's just your throat, all right? Covering your trachea, there's that epiglottis again. So that's what they're pointing to there, okay? So number 2 is the epiglottis, a flap of tissue that closes that trachea off every time you eat or drink, okay? Again, unless there's laughter going on. Here's your mouth, okay? So we are going to label that. Why? Because it's a plan B. You need oxygen so desperately for cellular respiration that if this should get congested, you need another way of getting oxygen through. So if you look at this, you know as well as I do, you can breathe through your mouth, so oxygen can pass through that. Oxygen-rich air can pass through that. And carbon dioxide-rich air will go in the opposite direction. So keep that in mind as I'm teaching you about this. I'm going to be referring to oxygen-rich air, but oxygen-poor air will go in the exact opposite direction. All right, so there's your epiglottis. That's going to cover this off. Now, what is this thing here? This is your trachea. All right, so trachea, actually, I'm not going to highlight that because it's going to be covered by the passage of air. So air will go through this in this direction, and it passes down here. So this here is your trachea, number 7. The trachea, notice you don't see that nice smooth muscle that you would see with the esophagus. And that's because it's buried or covered by these rings of cartilage. So the trachea is so important for moment-to-moment life that it's going to be really well protected. And so we always refer to these things here as rings of cartilage. All right, so I'm going to put that in brackets here. It's covered in rings of cartilage. And what that does is it offers that smooth muscle underneath some support so your trachea doesn't collapse on you. The very beginning of the trachea, okay, there is called your larynx. So in your larynx, you're going to find your vocal cords. All right, I'll put that in brackets. So you're going to have vocal cords there. If you get an infection in your larynx, you get laryngitis, your vocal cords become inflamed, and you can't produce the sounds you would normally produce. So that's the larynx, and that's the very beginning of the trachea. Air will pass through that trachea, and then it'll go in one of 2 directions. So obviously, you know you have 2 lungs. All right, when we're looking at a diagram, this is always going to be our right side, and this is going to be our left side. Okay, and how you could remember that is if you would take this diagram and put it on top of you, okay, then you would have some idea why that's the right side and the left side. If not, you're just going to have to be satisfied with the fact that we reverse these. All right, so air is going through that trachea, and then air has the option of going into the right lung or the left lung. So as it enters into the lung, just before it goes into the lung, these tubes here are not labeled in this diagram. You need to know that these guys are called bronchi. Okay, so I'm going to label this a bronchus. So Latin, US is singular, and you have two bronchi. You've got a right bronchus and a left bronchus, which gives you two bronchi. All right, so if you see that I ending, that just means that's plural because you have more than one. The bronchi then branch in. As soon as they get into the lungs, they form these other branches, okay? And these smaller branches here are literally called smaller branches, and they're called bronchioles. So we have bronchioles. All right, and at the end of your bronchioles, so you'd have oxygen going in here, and obviously carbon dioxide would make its way out in the same passageway. Maybe the most important part of your respiratory system is at the end of these bronchioles. And so I'm just going to draw that in a few places there. I'm drawing in some circles like bubble wrap. You have to know that your entire lung is filled with this. Okay, but at the end of every little bronchiole, you are going to have a whole bunch of bubbles, a whole bunch of circles there. And those guys are referred to as alveoli. One is an alveolus, but I've got way more than one over there, so I'm calling that an alveol. I'm calling those alveoli. And these alveoli, like I said, probably, arguably, the most important part of your respiratory system, that's where we're going to have that gas exchange occurring that I spoke to you about. So surrounding each alveolus, you're going to have a capillary. Capillary is the smallest type of blood vessel that we have. And the capillaries are going to be oxygen poor because they're returning blood from the rest of the body. The alveoli is oxygen rich, and so we're going to have diffusion of oxygen occurring from the alveoli into the capillaries that surround it. All right, and just to finish up here, in this diagram, these guys here are indicating ribs, so that you know that you have ribs. Okay, the ribs are protecting everything in the thoracic cavity, so that's a term you should also know. Thoracic cavity. The thoracic cavity, if you were to lie on your back, you'd have two major cavities in your body. So you'd have two major places where your body kind of falls in. The one on top, your chest cavity, is called your thoracic cavity. And then right under that over here, we'd have the abdominal cavity. Okay, and that's where you're going to find your major organs of digestion that you just studied. So alveoli, extremely important. Ribs protect the thoracic cavity. Yes, you can have damage and they can certainly puncture a lung. That can be a consequence, but overall they do more good than harm. And then down here, okay, this is where you have number 10 on your diagram. That is your diaphragm. All right, and we'll get more into the diaphragm as we get through this week and this unit. But the diaphragm is a muscle that helps to move the lungs up and then back down when you're inhaling and exhaling.